I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I record this podcast. I am on Yuggabal country, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Hi Smart Community friends, and welcome back to this very special series here on the Smart Community podcast, all about data storytelling, as part of my PhD research. In this episode of the Smart Community podcast, I have a great conversation with friend of the pod, Dr. Marcus Foth. Marcus has been on the show twice before, in episode 230, and also way back in episode number 4. Marcus is a professor in urban informatics and strategic design at the School of Design at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. With extensive experience at the intersection of people, place, and technology, he leads research into smart city infrastructure adoption, sustainability approaches, and data governance issues. In this episode, Marcus tells us about a very timely example of data storytelling in the Brisbane 2032 Olympics Stadium controversy. We talk about the role of sophisticated data visualization consultancies in creating narratives that serve corporate lobbying interests over community needs, and the ways the increasing accessibility of AI tools may help democratize data visualization and address the skills, knowledge, and resources gap for grassroots advocacy groups. We finish our chat discussing Marcus's perspective on the need for critical thinking when using new data tools and the importance of civic engagement in our democracy. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Smart Community, Smart Regions, Smart Towns, and Smart Cities. It's where we live, work, and play with smart communities. The future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Marcus. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I'm trying to remember whether this is your second or third or maybe even fourth time.
Maybe the third.
Well, it's a long time no see, but let's not use this time to hang out. We are on the podcast, so I'm just going to jump straight in, hand over to you. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and your current work and projects?
Okay, sure. So my name's Marcus Foth. I'm a professor in urban informatics and more recently also in strategic design at the QUT School of Design, so Queensland University of Technology here in Brisbane, Australia. I've for a very long time been working across the intersection of people-place technology, which entails looking at how cities have evolved to embrace both technical practices amongst their citizenry, but also how investments into smart city infrastructure has been adopted, both the benefits as well as the pitfalls. More recently, we've been very interested in aspects of sustainability. And in that area, we've founded a group at QUT called the More Than Human Futures Research Group that is looking at design approaches and how they need to change in order to have a more genuine and ethical approach to sustainability. And other work more recently have been looking at data governance issues, geoprivacy, and we have just submitted a funding proposal that is looking at how we can help community groups to amplify their political advocacy, their ability to become active using data and data analysis in a more collaborative and participatory manner.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm so much in there. And I know you've done a lot of work, and obviously we know each other from the smart city space. And I know you've done some amazing projects working with data and continue to do so. So let's dive into a few of those. I'm happy to go whichever way you like. Thinking about data visualization and storytelling, what's your work or project or research been that involves that data visualization or storytelling piece?
Okay, so there's probably quite a number across the years. I might just tell you a little bit more about the most recent one because it's very recent and very timely, but also because it's maybe a little bit more unusual. But I do think it's a great example when we talk about data visualization. So this is pertaining to Brisbane hosting the Summer Olympics in 2032. There has been a lot of discussion and debate about which venue is going to be the main Olympic stadium for the opening ceremony, for the closing ceremony, for the main part of the athletics, for instance. It has now been announced after we had the state elections end of last year that this new government entered into a 100-day review, and at the end of it, they said it's going to be in Victoria Park. And so the reason why that is quite, I think, of interest and illustrative of data narratives is because together with this announcement, the government created, obviously, a dedicated website. There is press releases, but also there is renderings of what the stadium is going to look like. And so these artist impressions are based on data. They are based on how many seats do we need, where's it going to be, at what cost. So there's data about money, there's data about size, there's data about materials, and the list and timeline as well. So there's a time factor in it. And whilst it's not a typical data rendering that is a spreadsheet, it actually tells a story. And so the narrative that is told here is that we have to get on with the job. We have this timeline breathing down our neck, and we don't want to embarrass ourselves in front of the international audience. And so those are all reasons used to actually avoid a level of scrutiny that would usually be applied to infrastructure projects of this magnitude. If you were to invest that amount of money to something that is this big, there would usually be a whole bunch of checks and balances. You would usually ask stakeholders, ask the community. You have to go through legislation. You have to go through heritage protection, indigenous, land use planning, environmental, and the list goes on. So the artist rendering that was produced was of particular interest to us. And so we've been working with community groups that are very concerned about Victoria Park, which is the designated venue now for this new stadium. And they've engaged in what we call a site test analysis. So they took a whole bunch of data of an existing stadium, which is the Optus Stadium in Perth, because it comes close to what they're proposing. The Optus Stadium is about 60,000 seat, and it already sits there. So we know what it looks like in order to accommodate 60,000 seat. And so what we've been doing is take the existing stadium from Perth and actually, if you'd like, take a big drone and fly it across to Brisbane and place it in the spot where the government is proposing this new stadium to be, and it actually doesn't fit. So the site test analysis suggests that the narrative that's been used in order to tell the people that they can have their cake and eat it is actually bedazzlement. It's deceiving for multiple reasons. One, it's too small. It's only about 2/3 of the size of what the 60,000 seat stadium in Perth would occupy. The second reason why it's a lie is that it depicts a whole bunch of mature trees, like gum trees that look like they are 30 or 40 meters tall. So again, that's data about the existing canopy, the tree canopy, and again, having these visual symbols about sustainability, because it makes this artist impression really green. It looks really nice. The problem, though, is that you can't build a stadium with all these mature trees in the immediate perimeter and the immediate surroundings. And so what we've been doing is to actually look at all the new built stadiums since the Sydney 2000 Olympics all the way to now. And it has a analysis across the artist impression before things happened, then photos during construction, as well as photos of what it looks like when it's finished. And there is a pattern pretty much that in every single case, there is a very utopian, glorified kind of best case scenario of having lots of greenery and lots of trees. When you fast forward to what is actually being built, what usually these artist renderings don't show you is that these stadiums require exit routes, and they need to have the ability to allow people to be evacuated really quickly. If you have the Olympics, you also have the scheduling issue that you might have a session at 12 o'clock and another session at 5 p.m. So you've got to actually swap out 60,000 people that need to go somewhere. That means there's usually a huge forecourt. So the list goes on. What I'm, I suppose, telling here is a particular tension between the way that data gets communicated through a visual narrative that is actually not true to what the pattern, the historic pattern is suggesting. And it's done so on purpose. So it actually undermines the community's ability to engage in any kind of debate about this, because it looks like it ticks all the boxes. There is this rhetoric about we have to get on with the job, and there is very little ability for the community now to express any opposition. And so that is just like one example where a whole bunch of lessons can be learned from this. One is the kind of literacy that's lacking. People look at this artist rendering, and many people don't see the problems. They don't see the problem between a stadium that is touching mature gum trees that is just not happening in reality. They don't see the problem that the evacuation plazas have not been rendered. They don't see the problem that the size has been artificially reduced to make it look more palatable. So there is not just a lack of data literacy, there's kind of a lack of the criticality needed of people looking at this and picking it up. So the narrative is constructed to be very safeguarded, and then the media goes hand in hand and helps the government construct these narratives to really undermine any kind of opposition that this proposal might face.
When we think about that as a visualization and then digging into it from a data perspective, some of the points you've made there around how you construct a narrative. So building trust, for example, getting reputable people on board, and then I guess digging into the data behind those visualizations is something that is, for a community member, is really difficult to do, particularly when it looks fine and finished and, you know, that lots of things that it sits on seemingly a really big foundation of data and things like that, which is what, from a, you know, visualization perspective, those are all things that you want to have a really nice visualization. But learning from that, if it does look finished and does look polished, people are less likely to question it. So it's a, you know, it's a tactic you can use on either side of the coin there, where it's like, if you're trying to persuade or influence people to, you know, make a certain decision or I guess buying into a certain narrative, having those types of things can be really useful from a public good perspective, but then also asking the questions as well on the other side when we are trying to dig into the data and the accuracy.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think once communities start to adopt some of these tactics, they can start to fight back. But in my experience, it still is a David and Goliath kind of fight, because government obviously have far more resourcing and money and consultants and expertise at their disposal in order to create these data visualizations. Whereas if you then identify issues with that, in order to be able to create a rebuttal, you as a community group or as an individual are really disadvantaged compared to the kind of the magnitude of the machinery that you are facing up against. So we were very lucky in that there were volunteers that had some of these skills and they weren't part of the team in order to do this. And there were also just very interesting pockets of expertise around specific aspects of data analysis, like for instance around transport. Like one of the things that I didn't realize to that level of detail or granularity is how do you actually move 60,000 people, right? So you kind of imagine they're all sitting in the stadium, but they got to arrive, and then at some stage they want to go home. And so pretty much with any stadium of that size, there's modeling done. And the modeling, and you'd be familiar with this, isn't just about snapshots that are frozen in time. The modeling is actually looking across time, like arrival at what stage, how much time there would be for people to move from wherever the, you know, train or bus stations are into the stadium and so forth. And so the modeling analysis that was done specifically on the transport for this suggests that there is no way that the Brisbane transport system in that area, even with the proposed extensions of infrastructure and train stations and so forth, would cope with 60,000 people leaving at the same time. So the strategy that most stadiums then employ is to slow people down, which means that once you exit the stadium, there is other entertainment, there's a pub, there's food, there's facilities, there is other things for people to do. There's, the parents buy the kids an ice cream or whatever it might be, a whole bunch of things that is all designed to make sure that the transport system doesn't collapse. If there was nothing and people all just wanted to jump onto the train, that would just create chaos. So that, again, is not visualized. It's not in the rendering. And if you compare it with other stadiums, you actually see all these auxiliary kind of facilities that have been constructed for that purpose. So people might just think, oh, that's optional. That's like a nice to have, but actually it's not. It's like an essential part of operating a stadium, because without that, you would create complete havoc on the existing transport system, even with the expansions that have been planned.
Yeah, and I think creating it as, like you talked about, the safety elements as well as then slowing people down with crowd control and all these type of things. And I think then from thinking about communicating that when you're in the stadium, for example, having, the signage or whatever to actually tell people, this exit is full, so don't go that way. Like this kind of digital wayfinding, which is visualization, I suppose, in a way, showing the data in real time to help people make decisions is another key component. And I think what you said there around that people might think that's a nice to have, I think that's a really poignant point, because when it's there, we're like, oh, this is great. Or we're not even actually, as a community member, you're probably not even thinking about it. You just go, I had a great experience, I had a drink after, and then I caught the train home a couple of hours later or whatever. Whereas when it doesn't work, when we don't have those facilities or whatever the case is, and we're stuck at a train station or we've had to walk for, kilometers or whatever, then we go, oh, really, I should have thought about this, or how we choose to voice our frustration. But it is really interesting, because sometimes we won't necessarily pinpoint it down to, oh, well, it's because they didn't have anything to do after. Because I've been in both situations, like after a concert's finished and, in our head, it makes sense that you can't all get on the train. But once you're trying to get out of a space and there's nothing else to do, then you end up, following the crowd, I suppose, and then going, oh, well, this is the way it is. So what we end up doing.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so there's a lot in there. I'm curious to ask you around, from an advocacy piece. Because I do, in the research I've been doing so far, a lot of my literature is pointing to individual decision making, not necessarily from that high level advocacy piece of big change, big policy change, big shifts in decisions. So from an advocacy piece, if we're thinking about the Olympics as this example, what types of things from community advocacy or from, your own kind of advocacy, what kind of things would you look at to try and shift the needle or influence them to make different decisions? What types of things are you looking at using? And I guess from a data perspective as well.
So in theory, in an intact kind of framework, you'd kind of assume that advocacy is about identifying options. Right. So you kind of think, well, if we stay with that example of Olympics, the options are stadium goes here, 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 or there might be options around refurbishment. At a very meta level, the very first option was, do we want it or not? Do we actually want to bid for it or not bid for it? Do you want to host the games or don't host the games? So it's always about options, and advocacy then comes in when different interest groups, community groups, but also corporate and commercial players then get behind some of these options. The theory is that options get put forward with cases that provide evidence about the pros and cons, and it's the role of government and decision makers to then toss up these options and the evidence associated in order to come up with the best decision. The issue that I see here is that system is broken. And it's been broken not just for the stadiums, but it's entirely broken in this country, because we have, I think, largely abdicated our responsibility for evidence-based policymaking, largely because often the evidence would suggest that a decision has to be made that is not popular with the public. And if politicians want to get re-elected, they opt for what's popular with the public rather than what's good for the planet or the society or climate change or health outcomes or whatever have you. And so you can look at the entire spectrum of how data gets analyzed, prepared, visualized, communicated, and then turns into narratives. That is then, it suits a particular outcome that has been identified as strategic by political players in order to maintain a re-election campaign, in order to maintain political donations from corporates to parties and so forth. So if you look at, again, the stadium debacle, there has been now years of options being deliberated and evidence attached to all of these cases. I think largely community groups have lost faith in there being a proper, rigorous, independent analysis that comes up with the best for the city. What is communicated as being the best for the city is actually the best for the AFL, because the AFL is the biggest vested interest in that space. And it really is them calling the shots here in Brisbane as well as in Hobart with the stadium over there. And so we then have all of a sudden a situation where governments are actually beholden by the corporates that exercise their influence not just through advocacy, but actual lobbying. And so the lobbying is another step that is, I suppose, the much more commodified approach to advocacy. And the fear I have is that community groups are really lagging behind in their level of expertise, in their level of ability to amplify their grassroots advocacy. So you kind of got the KPMGs, the Ernst & Youngs, and all those kinds of data visualization consultancies that get hired by big corporates as part of their lobbying efforts. Governments do a whole bunch of negotiations and discussions behind closed doors. And so the actual situation in terms of the consultation piece, then a colleague of mine has brought it down to the DAD principle, DAD. DAD principle stands for decide, announce, and then defend, right? So you kind of already decide to suit the stakeholders and corporates that need to be kept happy. You make an announcement, and then the data visualization and the narrative that comes out is to defend the decision that's already been made, to really take away any kind of opportunity for there to be another option on the table to be deliberated. And so that is often very disappointing because in so many cases, that's precisely the reason why we can't have nice things in Australia, because it's just so much state capture where corporates are dictating policy outcomes without that there is evidence-based policy making actually at play at all. And that is not just limited to this example of the stadiums, that also extends into, for instance, why the gambling industry can still continue to advertise, despite all the promises and commitments prior to the election that this would be regulated. This is why we have ongoing challenges and debates about net zero when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the reform works in the energy sector. And the list goes on. And so that is really something that we are, I suppose, struggling with as a nation. Where I see this heading is that community groups need to increasingly hone their skills in order to be able to mobilize the masses and educate the masses, because at the end of the day, we're still voting at the polling booth. And so what I think is really exciting is the ability of some of these data tools and narrative generation to be made more accessible to individuals, more accessible to community groups. If you, for instance, think about what is currently possible through some of the Gen AI tools, that would have been coming at a huge price tag not too long ago, a couple of years ago, if you had to pay experts or consultants to do that kind of piece. And now you can actually produce something quite semi-sophisticated with next to no money. And so I think community groups, it's really just very, very early days. But as these tools become both more accessible as well as more sophisticated, my hope is that it will elevate the ability of these community groups to fight back against these vested interests, because the actual fight isn't directly with each other. The actual fight is how many people can you reach, right? And so with the decline of the old media And with people getting their news from different social media platforms, that is still a very exciting kind of dynamic, because it's not about who can afford a full-page ad in The Australian as a national newspaper. Because, whilst Murdoch is still being seen as the fear factor with politicians, the reality is that the readership is shrinking and shrinking, and not many people care. They get their information from social media sources, and that is a huge opportunity, combined and coupled with Gen AI tools that are lowering the barrier of access and ability for some of these issues to be communicated. So the more people actually wrap their head around of what's really going on, the more of an ability we will have to actually return to something that resembles evidence-based policymaking.
Yeah, and I think the more tools we have, the more an accessibility to these tools, the more rigor we need from an expert perspective around what data is actually being used behind those tools. But the more we can use them, or the more community groups can use them, then they can ask those questions as well. You learn as you're doing, when you're creating a data visualization, for example, charts, renderings, maybe whatever the case is, but you can start to ask those harder questions as well. Once you realize that sometimes the really sophisticated, chart that you're looking at has actually been created by somebody who isn't a data scientist, but they've pulled the data from publicly available data or wherever they've got it from, and then they've shown it in a certain way, and they'll make certain decisions about what they want to show and what story or what narrative or what message they want to deliver. And I think that's both a good and a bad thing. And the scale, as you mentioned, so how many people we can actually touch and influence, is also that it's not a good or a bad thing either, because if misinformation is obviously a huge problem as well, and the more tools we have available, but we will have to, it makes it easier to, say, produce something, but we need our critical thinking to increase significantly, because we need people to be asking those questions behind the scenes so we can know that it has, gone through rigor. It has, and all of the time, it's only part of a story. You can't tell the full story all of the time. And I think particularly with social media, we know that we're only getting snippets, but sometimes we just, create the rest of it with our own minds. Talking about, I guess, that impact and scale, I'm keen to hear some of your thoughts around any impactful data visualizations or stories that you've seen around the place that have left an impression on you.
Look, there is sometimes very, very impactful, very good visualizations created by the ABC. They actually investigate, the investigative team, when they do those longer style articles where we kind of scroll through and different visualizations kind of come in together with a narrative. In many cases, they're doing a very good job that is much better than anything else that I've seen in other outlets. In order to create a narrative, it's actually creating data visualizations that are accompanied by a narrative in order to explain the nuances, to explain, for instance, sources, to explain uncertainties, to explain meaning and different ways of interpreting. And so those have been really useful, whether it's, for instance, about housing affordability and the regional kind of spread, or combating stereotypes or misinformation, as you mentioned, because sometimes ABC takes that on and says, well, is it really the case that, for instance, the international students are the reason that we have a housing affordability crisis? And actually, no, it's all bullshit. It's just a populist kind of approach by both the coalition and the Labour government to now increase, international student visa fees, to delay the processing, to shame them in taking away housing, when really the reality is that is not the case. The evidence suggests that there is, I think, what was the figure that I saw in one of those articles? I think it was 3 or 4%. And the majority in that bracket really is going into dedicated student dormitories. So even if these student dormitory kind of buildings that are already in existence in the major capitals are empty, how is that going to help housing affordability? Is that just going to be taken up then by domestic students? Well, it's definitely not going to be the kind of panacea solution that is going to create a remedy for the housing affordability crisis. And so those are some examples of where I see really impactful data visualizations and narratives that actually take, I suppose, myths and hearsay and misinformation and then really unpacks it using hard evidence and kind of saying, this is the data that we have available and this is how we can interpret it and analyze it. And we are taking you by the hand to show you how our analysis has done that. So it's not just, I suppose, showing the results, but it's actually showing the process as well. That's kind of very powerful.
Yeah, I think showing the process is really powerful. And what it's doing, I guess, by taking myths, it provides a bit of a, the curiosity, the hook. It brings us in and I think they're aimed at, I guess, community members. I love the ABC. I am a bit of a fangirl of their data visualization team because they just help people make sense of things so much more clearly. And because they're aimed at, sharing information on that the community is interested, I guess, public issues or public, discussion, they're starting a conversation. So, I'll then go, oh, hey, have you seen this one about the energy, for example? And, they're creating these little really easy to absorb, easy to digest articles that then you get, again, that bit of information that you might have been missing from that, or just that you were curious about. And then you can also then follow the source and go and find, other information if you want to go a little bit deeper. And I think what you also said about the nuances, the narrative adding the nuances, I think that's really important too, because it's not, as we know, we exist in this system, system of systems. So we can't just change one thing and expect that, oh, well, we've solved that problem. It's going to then have that flow-on effect, as we know. And so I think when we think, oh, well, we just need to do this and then housing affordability will be solved, we know that that's not the case. But I think those articles then show that there's nuance as well, that it's not just this, it also has to be that, and also that these are the things that are in the way, or these are the barriers. I think they are really important to start to get people to have those intelligent conversations, because I think sometimes people think that, oh, I can't engage because I'm not a data scientist, but if you can start to just, I guess, absorb some of that information, and then on the other side, that the creator is helping that absorption because we're speaking in a language that the community can understand. But I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, we talked about some impactful data visualizations. I don't know if there's any other ones, maybe ones that if you've been involved in any, or how you've used data to, I guess, inform decision making, or other examples that you know of around the place that have had impact.
I suppose the other thing maybe to add as part of this discussion is the bigger picture around data, and maybe that's kind of second nature to you and to listeners, but perhaps useful to just mention explicitly, which is around governance and the data governance piece. We've been doing a lot of work on that, which then pertains to, for instance, how is the data collected, under what conditions. There is risk of bias being introduced that gets exponentially amplified through large learning models and machine learning. There is risks around privacy and surveillance. There is risks around data sovereignty. So there's actually some bigger questions surrounding all of this. And the two case studies that we looked at more recently were the Google Alphabet Sideboard Labs debacle in Toronto a couple of years ago that even led to that project being abandoned, and what's been happening over a number of years now in Barcelona, in Spain, in contrasting those two approaches. So that's been really interesting from that larger data governance point of view, to kind of see this one example that was very corporate driven, it was centralized, it was using nice language that wasn't backed up with evidence and with actions, versus Barcelona being much more grassroots, being much more progressive in their thinking. Not perfect, still lots of issues to resolve, and it's an ongoing challenge, I suppose, but it's interesting to see that commitment to at least trying to address some of these issues in very innovative ways. And so we've published on those cases, and other colleagues have done as well. And I think increasingly I've now been approached by other cities that kind of are catching up on these discussions, whilst they have had a long history of investing in smart city technology and IoT sensors and all the hardware, both in the built environment and inside those data centers in order to make these pieces work. I think it's only now really percolating to the more interesting outer layers of what data analytics can do. I think the excitement around parking in the city or, waste disposal or, those typical showcase use cases, I think they've lost their glossiness. They've lost their shine. A lot of it is now second nature. It's been implemented. It's not that exciting anymore to win over councillors, win over politicians, win over stakeholders. And so there is, I think, much more interest now in finding ways to unlock some of that potential and make it available to individuals, to community groups, but also to businesses and other organizations, whether it's small, medium enterprises, whether it's larger businesses. They obviously have usually a long history of using some of this data, but then being able to tap into some of the city data is always very exciting, but it has to then be done through these very solid governance arrangements. And that is still an ongoing, I think, challenge. And this is kind of all what I'm talking about, I suppose, at the, the back end, which is like data collection, analysis, what are we going to do with it? And then you kind of come to the front end, which is what's going to happen with that? What is it going to do for us? And is it going to be any meaningful? Is it going to be impactful? Is it going to make people excited? And again, we are still looking for these really compelling use cases because food trucks can only do so much, right? So there's these maps about where they are, and there's other kind of use cases that have been created to try and excite the public, not just the, parking stuff, but the more community-oriented use cases. I think that is still an ongoing arena for further research work and for the innovation, because it's not just a fast-moving feast, but there's going to be so many possibilities once there is a city administration that actually offers some more progressive ways for applications to be created. A lot of it is really held back by being very risk-averse and trying to just keep to internal use cases. Once you contemplate some of these more community-facing use cases, there's going to be some exciting work that can be done. But again, it needs to be all couched in really solid governance arrangements, data governance arrangements. And that's, I think, where a lot of the interest is in terms of the research.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I think it's obviously, well, not obviously, but like the community aren't thinking about data governance per se. And I think there's so much in that around, who owns what data, who should own what data, who has access to that data. But then the back end, getting the back end sorted. So then when we are looking at the front end about how we visualize and how we tell stories with that data, et cetera, we've got our house in order to make sure that we're, keeping things in check, like privacy and things like that as well. There's so much in it. Yeah. And I think we still are working on that, as you said, from a smart cities perspective. Yeah, some of those applications and things now are embedded, which is great. So that's what we wanted. But how the data is integrated and flows and that ongoing nature of, and then being able to then build upon that for more exciting use cases is something that is the next kind of step in innovation and in the smart city space, or whatever we want to call it, smart community space. Yeah, and it is, I guess, a riskier space per se when we are working with the community, because we don't know, the biggest thing with innovation, we don't know it. We're not supposed to know if it's going to work or not. Yeah. And I guess failing publicly or with the community is something that is not necessarily what governments want to do.
I agree.
Now.
And it's also kind of, I think, even exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the KPIs used to assess whether it's impactful or successful are commercial KPIs. I think what would be really useful is to remind ourselves that a city isn't just embedded around commercial KPIs, but it should have civic KPIs. That's where the whole word civics comes from in the first place. So it has a strong correlation to a notion of citizenship. of what you do, your rights, your obligations. And so if you apply civic KPIs to whether something is successful or not, it looks very different. But it also has then different aspirations around labor and time, right? So at the moment, if I spend 3 hours contributing feedback and data and ideas and my creativity to a particular piece that is for a commercial player, I might expect that there's a remuneration, that there's an incentive, that they kind of reward me for my time, maybe not as an employee, but in some other form. But if it's couched in other language and it's actually recognized as a civic opportunity, as a civic service, as a civic obligation even, then the commercial, I suppose, dynamics change, but the time and labor doesn't. Like, it still requires there to be effort invested. And that is increasingly problematic because people are facing, cost of living crisis. They are facing so many different constraints and pressures from all sorts of parts of life these days that there's very little oxygen to actually be able to invest anything in that civic space. And so that's reducing the healthiness and the ability for our society to have a functioning civil society.
Yeah, I agree. And I think those benefits that aren't measured, but we can tell when they're not there, like community, for example, and loneliness and our mental health and all of these types of things that we're not necessarily measuring. Well, we are all measuring them ourselves. We know how, when we feel this or that, or when we don't get to do this, that, and the other. But a lot of the way we build community is through that time and labor and efforts that isn't through paid work or, yeah. I think we could have a whole conversation on that, Marcus. But we do have to wrap up. Let's just finish with any suggestions for listeners to use data storytelling in their own work or life.
I suppose it's useful to obviously explore and tinker and see what these new tools can do. But I suppose it's also at the same time really, really important to do this with a level of criticality. So what I kind of tell my students, for instance, is, go out there and have a go with the tools that are now available that everyone gets very excited about. So I'm not the one that is kind of saying, no, you can't use Gen AI. I actually do want them to explore these kinds of things, but do so with a critical mind to be able to actually then ascertain how do we evaluate the outputs. Some of it is very straightforward because you can kind of say this is a hallucination. But yeah, I'm still surprised where even these very simple examples of a lack of quality, they don't get picked up. And so I think it's an ongoing piece around new forms and levels of literacy that we now need to embrace. And that requires us to think about what kind of training, what kind of additional education is required to get people onto that same page, because otherwise, again, we are just facing the situation where a few of us are really prolific and critical and they know what they're doing. But the vast majority are still catching up, or they are at risk of being left behind in that kind of race.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, as we increase our use of AI, we need to increase that critical brain at the same time, which is a harder thing to do. But we've done it before with other, when we got calculators, when we got Google, when we got whatever, different search engines, and then we just got to we as humans need to level up as the AI also levels up and becomes more accessible and available.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, let's leave it there. It's been so great to chat with you, Marcus, and I really look forward to our next conversation. Thank you for being so generous with your time today.
Thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes at zoeether.com/podcast. That's zoeeather.com/podcast. Have you got a question for me or one of our guests? We'd love to hear from you. Just shoot us an email at hello@mysmart.community. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on LinkedIn too. And hey, ratings and reviews are always welcome. They help more smart humans just like you find the show. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.